Well, good morning and a very warm welcome to the Sustainable Business Network. My name's Wendy Buckley and I'm pleased to bring this session on sustainable procurement for you. For you this morning, we have Olivia Hollos, who's going to take us through legislation and market updates. And then delighted as our keynote speaker this morning to have Adam Tewkesbury from the NHS to talk about all of his work there in sustainable procurement. And finally, we have Stephen Laurent from Carbon Footprint, who's going to tackle the whole subject of measuring your supply chain carbon emissions, often seen as a very, very difficult subject. And Stephen's going to make that nice and easy for you. So let's have a look. Does your business currently have scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions assessed? I think that's pretty good to see actually. Speakers, any surprises in there? Are we pleased? Hopefully we're pleased with that result, yeah?
Yeah, definitely pleased. So scope 1 and 2 are obviously the mandatory or the ones you should be assessing at a minimum, and then scope 3 is anything extra. So yeah, it's good that people have got a good starting point.
Great. Okay. And, that's important because the scope 1 and 2 is really you getting your own house in order, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we'd always suggest that would be the first thing you need to do. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next one, which is around your do you have a sustainable procurement policy? I think I might go to Adam if I may actually. And did the splits in these sort of numbers here for our audience, does that surprise you?
I mean, scope 3 is always the trickier area to measure, so I'm quite encouraged by that. Really, 73%. Looks pretty good, and I completely understand the don't knows as well, because it is a complicated area. It's usually managed in a off the way sort of way. So yeah, no, that's good.
Great. Okay, and let's move to question number 3. Really sits as the friend, if you like, or this is the implementation challenge. Really, of yes, do you have a sustainable procurement policy? But this one's almost saying, yeah, and are you actually doing it? How does it actually look like? And yeah. That's a little bit of a mixed bag there. I mean, from there I read across that, yes, a lot of people have policy, but how that's actually going down in an organisation seems to be a little bit mixed. Any other comments there panel you want to make on that? Does that fit with what you generally see from businesses that you work with and within your businesses? I certainly recognise it actually. Great. Okay. Let's go to the final question here. Does your business assess its scope 3 emissions? Okay. Stephen, what do you make of these numbers?
Yeah, we've got quite a spread there, I think, which is probably to be expected. It's good to see that quite a lot of people are actually assessing it somewhat already. We've got a few doing it comprehensively as well. So, but yeah, for the people currently doing it roughly, and people who are doing a bit of it, hopefully we can sort of run through some easier ways to do that later.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for voting on that. This really helped us actually to shape this session. We will move on to our first presenter of the morning, and delighted to have Olivia Hollos to take you through the legislation and market best practice. Over to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Wendy. Cool. Good morning, everyone. So like with every Sustainable Business Network, we start with the legislation and market updates before we get into the speaker presentations. So a lot has happened sort of in the last quarter of 2025 and sort of the last 6 months, really. So I'll just dive in to what's happened and get you all updated. So obviously COP30 in Brazil and Belém has concluded. That concluded last month. And these are just some of the key takeaways from that climate summit. So the first one, perhaps the most disappointing outcome of all, a new draft text on the outcome of COP30 climate talks has been published, but it contains no mention of a phase out of fossil fuels. So in COP28 a couple years ago, The headline outcome was plans for a transition away from fossil fuels. So that was all really exciting, but 2 years later, there has been a blocking of this fossil fuel roadmap. This doesn't overturn the legal agreement made at COP28, but effectively the roadmap exists on paper, but currently there are no operational mechanisms to make it happen. So yeah, not looking too great there. In terms of the US, so as I'm sure you're aware, this was the first COP since 1995 that the US was not officially represented. Trump, under his second administration, withdrew from the Paris Agreement again. And obviously this is a framework that underpins these climate summits. And also there is a fundamental policy clash between the Trump administration and COP30. Obviously COP30 is a summit designed to end oil and gas. And this is sort of an area that Trump is very much championing. So he obviously has conflicting views with the climate summit, and obviously for that reason did not attend. However, California showed up. California are a leading state and prove what American climate leadership should look like. And the state is known for countering the Trump administration's environmental policies, and strongly believe that the Trump administration does not represent the climate issues or the view of the public. And then finally, the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, TFFF, was officially launched with an initial capitalization of $5.5 billion US. The funding is designed to provide guaranteed long-term payments to countries to keep their tropical forests standing. So Norway was the largest single donor, $3 billion US over the next 10 years. Unlike previous funds that paid for stopping deforestation, the TFFF pays countries annual returns for maintaining existing forest cover. So we've gone from reducing a negative to now rewarding a positive. So that's everything that did happen at COP30. So what didn't happen? So the original plan was to launch the ISO, the International Standards Organization's net zero guidelines. So this was going to be an international standard designed to provide a single, globally agreed and verifiable framework for net zero. So it wasn't launched at COP as originally planned, but something else was done instead. So instead at the event, ISO announced a formal harmonization partnership with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is another globally well-known framework for accounting and reporting for carbon emissions. So rather than releasing a standalone standard that might clash with others, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Science-Based Targets, ISO and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol have decided to form this joint action plan instead. And the plan is to align their methodologies by roughly 2028 to create a single unified global infrastructure for carbon accounting and net zero verification. So hopefully it will make the process and the journey to net zero for companies a lot easier. So moving away from COP30 and talking more about green claims. So the EU Green Claims Directive is a EU legislation intended to dictate what you must do if you want to make a specific environmental claim. And it applies based on destination, not location. So obviously EU companies, but if you're not an EU-based company, but you sell products or services to customers in the EU, you must follow the rules. However, as of this year, later this year, the Green Claims Directive is currently stalled. And this is because the rules require sort of a third-party verification of any single green claim made. And obviously this is quite a timely and costly process. So this was particularly impacting SMEs. So the cost and time delays of getting the third-party verification were argued to be stifling to their business. So there's another law that did pass instead. So this is another EU law. So the EU Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. So this is EMPCO. EMPCO basically states what you shouldn't be saying when making an environmental claim. So this law relates to products. So EMPCO says on consumer products, you cannot really say general environmental claims such as eco-friendly, green, sustainable without having hard proof to back up that excellent environmental performance. Additionally, there is the controversial ban on specific items saying carbon neutral. This is particularly odd because ISO have released their own definition of carbon neutral. So offsetting isn't banned, the claim is, but instead of saying things like carbon neutral product, companies are encouraged to say things like we invest in climate projects, we've assessed the emissions associated with our product, these are our assessed emissions. So just what the picture indicates here. So sometimes these wishy-washy eco-friendly terms, we want them to be a bit more robust. And yeah, just we've got to be careful what things you're saying associate with your products. So all in all, the how to prove it law, so the GCD is stalled, whereas the what you can't say law, the EMPCO is proceeding. In terms of the UK, at the moment, there's no explicit ban in the text of the law yet. The CMA, Competition and Markets Authority Green Claims Code, states that relying on offsets without reducing your own emissions first is misleading. So watch this space for similar rules in the future, same as the EU. Moving on to the UK sustainability reporting standards. So from next year, for quoted companies and economically significant companies, this will be the new rule book for UK company sustainability reporting. The standard is expected to start from accounting period starting from the 1st of January 2026. So if your financial year runs calendar year, you will be expected to report in 2027. And essentially, it's not a it's building on the current SECR, so Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting Framework that a lot of companies follow in the UK. So it's not a like-for-like swap. The SRS requires a lot more, it's quite stricter, it requires a lot more information. So for example, SECR currently looks backwards. You need to report your energy and carbon emissions related to those SECR emission sources. The UK SRS takes this and it builds on it. So you also need to look into the future. You need to be considering your climate risks, financial risks, and how you're going to adapt to those and deal with those. In terms of scope 3, the SECR only mandates business travel reporting. UK SRS, you must report all material categories. So this is including your supply chain. And in terms of strategy, SECR currently doesn't really have any. It's just some data tables and a energy efficiency narrative, whereas the UK SRS requires this, but also you need to produce a net zero transition plan. And the standard is in two parts. So the first part is a general requirement. So it asks for companies' social and nature risks on the company's finances. So things like, aside from climate change, things like water scarcity, workforce safety, things like that. Then the second standard is the climate-related disclosures. So that wants you to publish the hard numbers on how climate change is impacting your company. And this is when it requires you to report your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So for the first 2 years, companies only need to do the second standard, just the climate-related disclosures. And then after that, companies will be required to do both. ESOS, we're always mentioning ESOS. So ESOS phase 4, the compliance period is underway. So the compliance period this time around is there on the screen, with the 5th of December 2027 being the final submission date for the compliance notification. The qualification date is in a year's time, 31st of December 2026. There were some initial changes that were going to be proposed for ESOS phase 4. However, These have now been delayed until phase 5. So for the time being, companies won't have to include in their ESOS audits how their energy consumption and emissions are going to be aligned with net zero. And also, there was an original plan to change the qualification thresholds. The original qualification remains the same for ESOS phase 4. ESOS phase 5 may see these qualification thresholds fall more in line with SECR reporting for companies. And finally, the APU, so the action plan, the first action plan annual progress update was due a week ago now. So you can still submit your late action plan updates to the portal. However, the Environment Agency may take appropriate enforcement action, which could include fines and public disclosure of non-compliance. Next, we've got the simpler recycling updates. So as I'm sure you know, the update to the Environment Act 2021 in regards to recycling sort of kick-started this year. This started first in businesses with 10 more staff. Businesses are now required to separate their recycling and their food waste from their general waste. Next on the list is households. So by 31st of March 2026, all households will have their food waste collected curbside for them from the local authority. And again, this needs to be separated from general waste. In a couple of years' time, it'll be micro businesses, so less than 10 staff. And again, they need to be separating the recycling and the food waste from any general waste. And at the same time, this includes everyone. Plastic film must be collected for recycling. So bread bags, film wrap, things like that you would usually take to a supermarket. Government guidance indicates that this will not be collected separately, but instead you can add it to your current recycling mixed bin that you have at home. And the last bit of legislation updates, so the Procurement Act 2023, the new procurement regime. So this links quite closely into what Adam will be discussing today. So the Procurement Act 2023 mandates that public bodies must pursue certain objectives and take into account national priorities when making their buying decisions. So the new procurement regime was live from February 2025, and key changes. So it's gone from what's called a meat factor to a MAT factor. So originally in the old procurement regime, public bodies were told to go for the most economically advantageous tender, so the one that was going to save them the most money. Now it's going to the most advantageous tender, so it's dropped the economic, and now companies are focusing more on sustainability. So contracts will be awarded to suppliers that offer better environmental solutions. So this is the single most important legal change for sustainability. It allows public buyers to legally justify that the advantage is sustainability, not just price. Additionally, supply chain visibility will become a big thing. So Scope 3 emissions questions, public bodies are now asking more of these. They don't just want to know what your Scope 3 footprint is. They want to know how you're calculating this, what methodology you're using. They want to know what percentage of your suppliers have signed a commitment to net zero, have they got targets in place. They also want to know how you will transition your reporting. So are you just using spend-based data at the moment? Will you eventually move that over to activity data, Scope 1 and 2 emissions from suppliers, which is more accurate? So they want to see your forward thinking of how you will report these Scope 3 emissions. So this new procurement regime is actively encouraging companies to go green, not just out of goodwill, but because that is how you win the points required to get the contract. So in this new procurement regime, sustainability is becoming a core competitive weapon, which is great to see. And finally, prosecutions and fines, everyone's favourite bit. So firstly, in July 2025, so East Midlands Airport was allowing the discharge of drainage water containing aircraft and runway de-icing fluid into the environment. The discharge failed to meet the environmental quality standards that was in its permit. So as a result, was fined a large sum of money for 3 separate offences. The airport actually has a poor history of permit compliance. Prior to this case, there were 13 separate permit breaches since 2006, resulting in 10 written warnings. Next, the skip hire boss was ordered to pay back £250,000 after she was found to have profited from a legal waste crime. So the EA secured the confiscation order after she was previously jailed for operating MWN Recycling Limited. She was given 3 months to pay this fine, or she faced up to 3 years in jail. And these are all the useful links. If you wanted to explore anything further, yeah, all there for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liv. That's always fascinating and round up, and I think it's prefacing as well what we're about to hear from Adam. I think we will just take one quick question, a good one there from Susie there on the chat. With the the new legislation coming in, I mean, it's not a replacement for SECR, is it? It's something a little bit different. I think Susie's question there relates to the size of entity that applies to, which Liv, I think it's not applying to all large entities, right? It's only specifics. Okay.
Yeah, so it will be so quoted companies, so those that are on the London Stock Exchange and any economically significant. I've got the criteria for that, so I can send that through into the chat.
Great. But yeah, I was thinking that was more like companies that are about sort of 500 people with turnovers that are probably, I'm guessing, more than 50 million pounds. But yeah, if you can let's pop the criteria into the chat, and you can be sure as this legislation comes through, we will be including more on those as we go forward. In the interest of time, we'll move on then to our next presenter, and absolutely delighted to have Adam Tewkesbury. Over to you, Adam, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so my name is Adam Tewkesbury. I am head of sustainability. I work for 2 NHS trusts, actually. So I work across Hampshire hospitals and Southampton trusts. So that's a footprint of 4 major hospitals, about 20,000 employees across all sites, and a really big kind of local population footprint in terms of care. So quite a big patch, quite a lot of activity across all of our sites. What I would also say is I'm relatively new to the NHS, so I joined the trusts in April. Worked in higher education before that, so university estates. So I'm still learning, and I'm still getting my head around some of the problems and some of the challenges for sustainability. So I'm going to cover sort of public sector and NHS procurement routes, and I think to follow, Stephen's going to cover more of a sort of a business and the calculations that flow through. So hopefully there's a bit of synergy through what we're going to talk through today. So firstly, why are we as an NHS trust considering our procurement routes? I mean, firstly, we have to as large organisations and as with the footprint we've got. There's an awful lot of purchasing going on through all of our sites, but as a health safety organisation, we're covered by a lot of legislation and policy requirements leading into the decisions we make. We're dealing with public money, so we need to make sure that those purchases are sensible. But also from an operational perspective, it doesn't take very long working in hospitals and in healthcare to realise there's an awful lot of opportunities there within our scope 3 emission calculations, but also just throughout that supply chain. It's a really complicated net. So we've got plenty of opportunities to make informed decisions, and across all trusts, there's also a number of people in positions such as mine where we can work together, where we can share good practice. So the opportunities to scale up impact are really significant. And all trusts from 2022 have been required to operate a green plan, which is basically a sustainability strategy. And all of those plans have just gone through their first 3-year cycle. So all trusts from October this year have updated their green plans. And this diagram just shows the 10 key areas that all green plans for trusts will cover. which include supply chain and procurement. So we've got a specific requirement to look into that area and to review purchasing decisions. And all of that ties into the NHS targets, the overall targets to be a net zero healthcare provider by 2040 for our direct emissions and 2045, which is the big challenge for supply chain. So this wouldn't be a discussion of carbon impact if we didn't have at least one pie chart. So this is the newly updated carbon footprint for trusts, and this is all trusts across the NHS. But you can drill down into this data to get trust by trust breakdown of emissions, and the data that sits behind this is improving all the time. So NHS England have they collate an awful lot of data on our behalf. So all trusts are feeding in direct and indirect emissions data to really improve our data set and understand the information we're working with. So this was updated September this year, and we're all working on the platform that sits behind this to make sure it's robust. But what you can see is that over the last over the last 3 years, I would say green plans have focused on the sections in green here, so the direct emissions, so scope 1 and 2, where most trusts now have a really robust understanding of probably not all the solutions to decarbonisation, but certainly the scale of the problem and the route we need to take to address, energy in buildings, energy within fleet, all those sort of things. This bigger chunk, the sort of 2/3 or more of our footprint that sits within scope 3 and supply chain, is the data is improving, but it's not 100% there yet. And I think that for the next phase of green plans will be the real area of focus to make sure we're moving forward wherever we can. But of course, it's a complicated picture, because whereas direct emissions are generally, they're impacted by a smaller number of bigger impact decisions, the supply chain decisions is lots and lots of small purchasing decisions made throughout all trusts that lead to it's the scale of the purchasing that's the issue rather than one specific decision. And just to sort of depict that in a slightly different way, I wanted to pick out this piece of work. So Maria Kojic she's a spatial artist who underwent a fairly serious medical operation a couple of years ago, but she used the opportunity to create a spatial artist. It was a video she prepared, and I've put the video links at the end of the presentation, so when the slides go around, you'll be able to have a look at it. But what it depicts, so this is all of the medical equipment and all the PPE that went into one of Maria's operations, and she undertook a number of operations through her treatment. And if you think that that's the volume of kit that goes into one operation, now across the hospitals that I represent, I think we have 70 operating theatres, which are operating, multiple operations per day. That volume of kit that we have to then purchase, store, and then dispose of in various ways, it's huge. It's a huge volume of stuff. So we're not necessarily talking about big pieces of equipment. We're just talking about a lot of stuff that goes through all of our sites every day. So in terms of how we address this and the approach we take, I think sort of referring back to Olivia's presentation, so we're trying very hard to embed this principle of triple bottom line. So make sure that every purchasing decision and every financial decision maker across the site, we're considering that spend, so the financial impact, we're considering social impact throughout all of our decisions, and we're looking at environmental impact on an even keel. So bringing that concept of triple bottom line into right to the front of all of our decision making, and that's taken some time to embed, but I think it's starting to get to the point where our procurement teams and our operational teams are taking that on board and coming back with solutions. So we've got a bit of a two-way dialogue starting to run. And for my team and for the people I'm working with, we're looking at that in 3 ways. So we're talking to our procurement teams, and across 2 trusts we have one procurement lead at the moment, so a group that deal with all of our purchasing. So that helps to coordinate what we're doing, and it helps us to engage with that team, but also to engaging with suppliers. So talking to our supply chain whenever we can, to look at how we can address some of the points of either single-use products or products that are specifically impacting our emissions. And we're also looking to intervene when we can, when we've identified issues. So there are points where we'll either audit or we'll be checking sites and we'll see issues that need to be addressed. And we've also got members of clinical teams coming forward and expressing where they see challenges within our supply chain. So we can then go and investigate those specific points and start to take action. So we've got a good flow of information running now. I wouldn't say we're 100% at the point where we want to be, but certainly we are moving forward in terms of that engagement and that understanding of impact. And we're supported throughout the system by quite a strong policy position. So a lot of the legislation leading through to green plans came through the Net Zero Health Service report that was published in 2020, I think. And then that was reinforced this year in the NHS 10-year plan. So the commitment within the NHS is there. And there's also, a growing, again, as Olivia set out earlier, a growing sort of network and web of policy that we can tie into to support decision making and support application of triple bottom line. NHS is also, very aware of reputational impact and reputational balance. So I think, we need to make sure that the decisions we make are robust and open to scrutiny as a public body. So there's an awful lot of support there for making sure we've got this balance right in terms of reporting. And we're also supported by a number of tools available across trusts. First, I wanted to pull out is the Net Zero Supplier Roadmap, and this is really an opportunity to kind of ramp up the expectation by trusts and by NHS organisations around our suppliers. So starting with an expectation of a level of reporting on direct emissions by suppliers, but then starting to work towards a point where we understand the indirect or the scope 3 emissions of all of our supply chain, and then get to the point where we've got product level understanding of across our supply chain. So that information, this sort of flow of improving information flow is working its way through. We're sort of, we're in that middle stage at the moment. But I think the maturity within trusts and within procurement teams is growing. It's really encouraging to see, and the data we're getting out the back of it as a result is much better. So then we've also got available to us as trusts this year the Evergreen assessment tool, and this is a self-assessment tool for suppliers. So all of our suppliers have access to the portal, and this is signposted to our supply chain, and it allows suppliers to test their maturity in terms of environmental reporting and carbon footprinting, all the stuff we're looking for. And similar to the roadmap, this is ramping up over time. So the expectation within NHS appointments at the moment is the sort of the base level of a commitment or a level of commitment on sustainability, but that expectation will grow, and we're expecting to get to the point where we've got a supply chain that's really bought into the sustainability challenge that the trusts are facing. And I think there's a lot of work going on the adaptation and the use of this tool in the way we report and also the way we appoint. So I think it's been successful, and I'm seeing from an operational perspective, seeing reporting coming back now through appointments, through projects, where we're now we're ranking our appointments based on the information coming through Evergreen, which is really encouraging to see that data coming through. So this sets out that process really just in a roadmap. So we're kind of at that corner, the second corner of this roadmap at the moment. We're working through just a level of data collection and making sure that, I suppose, at the moment we're not entirely there, but we're getting better information from suppliers, and we can start to point to good examples of compliance and good example of working through those processes. Where we want to be is at a point where all of our suppliers are consistently coming back with information on all of their emissions, and we can do a bit more work in terms of comparison and decision making to get to the point where we're appointing quite heavily weighted on environmental impact, and also on suppliers' ability to support us on delivering the NHS requirement for 2045. Ultimately, that's where we want to be reporting back. Of course, there's challenges. There's also challenges around this. I mean, partly that would be within our supply chain. I wouldn't say all of our suppliers are ready. We've got quite a lot of suppliers who've worked with NHS organisations for a long time, and this is a shift, and some are moving more quickly than others, and that's completely to be expected. But there's also challenges within trust themselves, because financial situation within the NHS is not brilliant. So resourcing levels are low in some areas. So it's just a challenge to make sure that we are positioned to be able to prioritise this in the way we would want to. We're all working with quite small teams, trying to make sure that we're doing whatever we can to deliver robust information and to be able to assess the information that's coming back to us. But that is a challenge. That I'm not going to hide from that. That's difficult for across our piece. And also to make sure that where we're working with businesses or organisations that sit slightly to the side of trusts, such as our procurement operation, make sure that they're completely bought into this, and we're consistently applying the processes that have been put in place, just to make sure that we're not missing opportunities. And I think that is getting better month on month, year on year. Green plan reporting is picking up where we've been successful and where we're still having challenges. But I think we've got to be very clear that we're not there yet. We're working towards a improvement, but there's still some work to be done. And I just wanted to pick out some specific examples from work at Hampshire hospitals where we've applied this successfully, because I think it's useful to relate it to actual things. So firstly, harmonic scalpels. So these are the devices that, if you're unlucky enough to have to go into hospital for an operation, this would be the device that's chopping you open. And for a while they were all single use, so these things were being used once and then being thrown in the bin. But whereas they can't be reused as a single item, there's opportunities within the supply chain to recycle and remanufacture those devices. So we've been looking and working with suppliers on a project to allow us to buy back remanufactured scalpels, and there's a double cost saving there. So we get some money back from our supplier for the used scalpel, and then we buy it back at a reduced rate. So that's saving the trust quite a lot of money. It's also saving us there's a carbon impact within the supply chain, and importantly, it's not impacting patient care. So it's the remanufactured device works exactly the same as a brand new one. So in terms of delivering on triple bottom line, that project has been really successful. Second one would be reusable surgical gowns. So and not just gowns, actually, gowns and caps and drapes, which are again all used in operating theatres. But particularly after the pandemic, we saw real growth in single-use items, and that's continued beyond the pandemic. So single-use became kind of the default, whereas previously there had been a push to move towards reused. But we're getting to the point where reusable gowns are much more openly used, and as you can see, saving the trust's money, it's significant carbon impact, because the cost of disposing of single-use gowns is really high when you have to go through high temperature incineration for all of that waste. And there's an interesting social impact to this, that for reusable cap use, surgeons, because they've got their own caps, were able to have embroidered into the cap their names. And we got quite a lot of feedback from patients who were really reassured to have someone who's clearly covered in PPE, face mask, all that sort of thing, and to have their name in front of them just humanises the person you're engaging with. And I think so that impact was really positive. And then finally, there's a project we've been working on throughout the last year, which is interesting in that it's engaging directly with our supply chain and our delivery actions. So we've looked at air quality monitoring within delivery yards, and that has allowed us to identify when we've got vehicles coming onto site that are high emission, so idling vehicles, usually idling older vehicles, And we've been directly engaging with our supply chain to highlight with data the impact that's had on hospital sites. And that has led to a process of rationalizing deliveries into sites. So essentially, reducing the overall number of deliveries into our sites, which is reducing carbon and particulates on our sites. It's also reduced cost because we're now using those areas more efficiently. We're not getting to the point where we've got backed up delivery yards, and the air around our sites is cleaner as a result for our patients. So, positive examples of stuff that's going on across hospitals right now, and these examples, they are being rolled out and they're being extended across other trusts. So we're starting to see a real economy of scale across those points. And I think that's all I was intended to cover. So if we've got any questions, happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Adam. Wow, that was absolutely fascinating. There's one thing I'm going to pick up whilst please do give your question to Adam now in the chat function. This is one I have to pick up on immediately. How refreshing is it to hear that your sustainable procurement is leading to cost savings when so many people say, isn't it just going to cost more?
I think if it costs more, then within the NHS and the challenges we have at the moment, it would be a real problem. So I think having to there's a real need to relate to that triple bottom line impact and really push the co-benefits. And what that does is it leads to decisions that maybe do cost a little more, but we can demonstrate impact. So cost is a very sensitive issue in NHS, and I'm sure that comes as no surprise to anyone. But yes, it's starting to snowball in terms of impact, which is again very encouraging.
Absolutely. There was one question I got actually on email rather than on the chat, which is, what has been the most challenging aspect? And I appreciate that you've not long been in the role, but just some general comments on what has been the most challenging aspect for the programme and how have you overcome it?
I would say probably the most challenging aspect would be momentum and maintaining momentum throughout organisations, because, certainly historically, sustainability and carbon reduction wouldn't be seen necessarily as like core business, I suppose, for trusts. So, and I work in, it's a relatively small team across a very large organisation. So having enough of a voice across the trust and maintaining momentum and engagement it has been a challenge, and it's still a challenge. But again, counterpoint and to sort of reassure on that, what we are seeing through implementation of the Green Plan is now these conversations, they aren't just at a local level. We're now, a Green Plan it's approved at trust board level. So we're having both internal and external scrutiny at a very high level in the organisation, and there's very clear and very vocal commitment behind the actions we're taking, which is hugely encouraging, and it makes a very big difference. And going back to that point on cost saving, if we can demonstrate efficiency through making these changes, that again really helps to prove the point that this is something we should be doing as a default. And I think
I mean, there are some naysayers out there. I did a keynote at the Unlocking Hampshire's Green Potential events just a couple of weeks ago, and I think just looking at the people on this session, quite a lot of you were there as well. And whenever you talk about sustainable procurement, someone's always going to put their hand up and say, but isn't it just going to be a cost to us? It's going to cost more. And so it's fascinating when you look beyond the here and now and you say, okay, what is that actually going to look like as you go down the line? Then the situation does move to a position where you will make some cost savings, not for everything, but you do have good capacity to make that. And I think, the difference is here with a lot of organisations on the session here in private businesses where you can build some of that, and it's only a little uplift into your cost model, then really what you're aiming for is just to come out as cost neutral, if not to make you some savings. So great. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we'll move on now to Stephen's presentation. So thank you again to Adam, and over to you, Stephen, if you could share your screen, please.
Excellent. So first of all, good morning, everyone. And thank you for our presenters so far. I think, Adam, that one's particularly interesting. I can't wait to watch that video that you showed that picture of later, because I can't believe how scary it is seeing how much is involved in just one operation. So it's mind-blowing, but yeah, I look forward to watching that later. So far we've had a look at the sort of regulatory scene very clearly. However, as in my role as an environmental consultant, I often find that while these frameworks tell you what targets you need to hit, they rarely explain actually how you can hit them without hiring a sort of dedicated team of data scientists. So working with procurement teams, it's clear to see that there is a lot of anxiety around this topic. People are being asked to become carbon accountants on top of their day jobs. They're sort of looking at the requirements and thinking, how do I calculate emissions for thousands of products? How can I get data from suppliers who don't even have a sustainability policy? And why does the data sometimes suggest that buying a greener product is actually worse for my carbon footprint? But my slot today is designed to sort of clarify the process of supply chain emission calculations. I want to take a step back from the high level compliance talk, which we've heard a bit about, and look more at the actual mechanics of the Scope 3 calculations. So we'll cover the practical methodologies for measuring the supply chain, look into data quality and why looking into the supply chain is beneficial, aside from for regulatory purposes. So you can move from the sort of anxiety to action. So to navigate this topic effectively, I've broken it down into sort of 3 key areas. So first, we'll look through the context. We'll look into why we're doing this beyond just the tick box exercises, and define exactly what we're measuring when we talk about the Scope 3 iceberg and the sort of carbon baggage that comes with that. Then we'll look at the mechanics. So this is a more technical section of the presentation where we'll look at the different calculation methodologies available, specifically the difference between spend-based and activity-based data and how to improve data quality over time. And finally, we'll move on to the action of it all. So I'll share a few practical tips on how you can engage suppliers effectively without overwhelming them. And then we'll wrap up with a quick summary at the end. So before getting into the how of supply chain calculations, it makes sense to look into why companies are doing this. So to be clear, this isn't just about regulatory compliance for things such as PPN, Evergreen, or any future sort of UK sustainability disclosure standards, which we've heard about that are being introduced, although it is a key reason for many people. If we view this purely as a compliance exercise, we're going to miss the whole value of calculating your supply chain. So for instance, if we look at the sort of bottom left corner there at cost and risk, historically, carbon and costs have been treated as separate conversations. However, there's a really strong relationship there. I know Adam mentioned about his sort of reused scalpels there. You're actually getting a carbon and a cost saving, so it is possible. But another example of this is if your supply chain is carbon intensive, by definition, that means it's energy intensive, which can mean your suppliers will be highly exposed to things like volatile energy markets and that sort of thing. So if you consider a company that manufactures steel using old inefficient kilns, when energy prices spike, their costs are going to skyrocket, and that inflation will be passed down onto you. On the other hand, if there's a supplier who's invested in on-site renewables or heat recovery or improved insulation, that sort of thing, you're going to be insulated from that as a buyer, because that will be passed down onto you. So understanding your Scope 3 emissions can be a proxy for understanding your inflation risk as well. So if a supplier is inefficient with carbon, they're likely to be inefficient with cash as well. So we can also look at the benefit to reputation. With climate change only becoming a more pressing issue going forwards, it's highly likely that strong sustainability credentials will be sought after even more than they are now. We're seeing government contracts where social value and sustainability now account for more than 10 to 20% of the scoring criteria, and I think this is only going to increase going forwards. But the same applies to the private sector as well. So major retailers and construction firms are now cascading these requirements down to their suppliers. So if you take Tesco for an example, they've made it clear that while they want to support suppliers, consistent failure to provide them with carbon data and reduction plans can lead to reduced prioritization for them in their procurement decisions. So effectively what they're saying is that if you supply a supermarket and you can't provide the data they need, for their net zero targets, you risk discounting yourself as a supplier by default. But finally, the last benefit is resilience. So we often find that when you start counting carbon, you inevitably find waste along with that as well. Whether it's empty space in logistics trucks or over-specified materials. You can look at the example of ordering virgin steel compared to recycled steel, when the recycled one would often meet the structural requirement. But by ordering the virgin steel, you're carrying a higher carbon burden and often paying a premium for that as well. So when we talk about the supply chain today, we're not just talking about the carbon impact, as this goes hand in hand with building a leaner, more cost-effective and more resilient supply chain as well. So moving on from the why, what we're actually looking to measure, well, we're largely talking about scope 3. So I know this iceberg analogy is a bit overused, but for carbon accounting, it is surprisingly accurate. So your scope 1 and 2 are your direct emissions, and your indirect from electricity as well. These are the bits that you can see, or the parts that everybody would think about in relation to greenhouse gases, your company cars, boilers, electricity bills, that sort of thing. And I think looking at the survey at the start, it looks like almost all of you are measuring this already. The data for this is almost always easy to collect, as you'll have invoices and fuel cards, meter readings, that sort of thing, which means they're often easy to control as well. Scope 3 covers everything else that you don't see. So it's the hidden bulk of the iceberg. For most people here today, scope 3 is likely to account for about 80 to 90% of your total carbon footprint. This is divided into your sort of upstream and downstream emissions categories. So as a rule of thumb, anything before goods or services reach your company counts as upstream, and anything after is downstream. So within scope 3, I've mentioned these various categories, there's 15 of them, but the often crucial one when we're mentioning supply chain is your category 1, which is your purchase goods and services. So this single item is usually the biggest figure on the entire balance sheet for carbon, as essentially almost anything a business is spending money on can appear here. So often people see this category as just the tangible materials or goods that have been purchased and don't think of the hidden services part as well. It can include the carbon footprint of all sorts, ranging from your cleaning company to legal companies, marketing agencies, and even things like cloud storage. So even though these are services, those providers also need to use energy and materials to serve you, and that share of their footprint will belong to you. So when you consider services as well, you can begin to get a sense of the scale of the category. At this point, it's important to consider that every item or service you buy arrives with a sort of backpack of invisible emissions. So the diagram on the screen is a sort of representation of essentially a product carbon footprint. You can think of a laptop, which would only weigh about 2 or 3 kilos, but its carbon backpack from mining rare earth metals, manufacturing chips, assembling everything, and all the transport in between all contributes to its sort of embodied carbon footprint, and that can be upwards of 300 kilos of carbon equivalent. You can also think of a service in the same way. It's a bit harder to imagine because it's more of an intangible product as such, but the same analogy applies there. So calculating supply chain emissions includes the accumulated history of a product before it even touches your hands, which is a very key point to keep in mind. So this brings us to the technical bit of the presentation of how you actually begin to calculate the carbon footprint of a laptop, a fleet of vans, or a consultancy contract. There are 3 ways you can do it, and you'll likely need to use sort of a combination of both or all of them. So the first one on the left is the spend-based method. So you'll have noticed from previous slides that there's a close relationship between spend and emissions, and from the previous presentations as well. This therefore makes a really good starting point for calculating an estimate of your supply chain. Essentially, you can take your financial spend on each product or service and allocate it to an industry sector. So in the UK, you'd use SIC codes and multiply it by a government-issued emissions factor for the relevant sector. These are often issued in the UK by DEFRA or the ONS factors for spend. This method gives you a very quick and 100% coverage method for your supply chain calculations. And However, as good as this is as a starting point, there are flaws with this. So imagine I were to buy a cheap high carbon plastic chair for about £50, and you were to go and buy a beautifully crafted zero carbon timber chair for £100. Because the spend-based method looks only at the currency, it will calculate that your highly sustainable chair has double the carbon footprint of my plastic one, just because it costs twice as much, and that will appear in the same industry sector. So it can actually penalise you for investing in quality. This is why we need the sort of middle option, which is the activity-based method. This uses physical units. So we stop looking at the money spent and start looking at litres of fuel or tons of cement, kilowatt hours of energy, sort of in a similar way to how your scope 1 and 2 would be calculated. It's far more accurate because it reflects what you actually consumed. But obviously you can't get that data for every single paperclip. So the realistic approach is the hybrid method. You can use spend for the long tail of your small, low risk suppliers to get a complete picture. And then you swap out that spend data for the activity-based data for your strategic or high impact categories. So visualizing the hybrid approach would give us what we call the data quality hierarchy. So the dream is to be at the top of the pyramid, of course, making use of the supplier-specific data such as EPDs or environmental product declarations or product carbon footprints, or similar, or supplier scope 1 or 2 upstream scope 3 data. That's the gold standard. It's where a supplier hands you sort of a certificate saying exactly how much carbon their product or service generated, and you can plug that directly into your results. But unfortunately, if you wait for the perfect data before you start your reporting, you'll never end up starting. So in practice, we'll always recommend that companies begin with a spend-based approach to screen their supply chain and get an idea of where the hotspots are. So you start with the spend-based estimates and use them as a map to show you where your hotspots are. You might discover that 60% of your carbon risk sits with just 3 suppliers, perhaps a steel fabricator and a logistics firm. Once you know that, you can stop using estimates for those suppliers. You move them up the pyramid. You don't need to harass your stationary supplier for the carbon footprint of a pen, but you do need to ask your logistics provider for the real fuel data. So I kind of want to pause here and look at what it's like from the other side of the table. So when we say moving suppliers up the pyramid, what we're actually asking them to provide, it's important that procurement teams understand the difference between the 2 types of data here. So on the left, we've got entity level data, which is often called a corporate carbon footprint. So I think, again, from the survey at the start, a lot of you seem like you've made strides into this area, specifically with scope 1 and 2 and some scope 3 as well, which is good to see. But essentially, it's where a supplier just tells you our total emissions are 1,000 tonnes for a year. It's a good starting point because you can take their total emissions, divide it by their revenue, and figure out roughly what your share is. So it's a relatively easy way for a supplier to calculate this once a year. A problem with this, however, is that the sort of scope that's included with this, there's different standards, can ask for different things. So when we complete these assessments, we ask for scope 1 and 2 and upstream scope 3 if possible, as we've already seen that this will likely cover the vast majority of a company's footprint. Including anything less than this risks skewing the effect of a company's having. So when we come to on the right, we've got the product data. So this is, I briefly touched on this before, but this is the product carbon footprint or the environmental product declaration side of things. It's where the supplier has done life cycle analysis of their product or service that you buy from them, where they've traced the raw materials, transport, manufacturing energy, just for that one item or service. So using this data, all you need to do is multiply the total emissions from that product carbon footprint by the amount you purchased, essentially. So it's important to recognise that asking for the right-hand side data, the product-specific data, can be expensive and difficult for suppliers. So an EPD can cost thousands of pounds sometimes to verify. So if you ask an SME for an EPD or a low-value contract, they likely won't have this data available. So the key when asking for this data from suppliers is to be precise. You can ask for entity level data for your general suppliers or that long tail potentially, and save the product data requests for more your strategic partners or companies where you have high spend or high product volume purchases from. So this leads nicely onto how to engage suppliers without causing things sort of survey fatigue and that sort of thing. So many of you will have undoubtedly received those very long 50-page sustainability questionnaires that ask sort of unnecessary questions a lot of the time. But we don't want to be the people sending those really. So to keep it as straightforward as possible, we can make use of segmentation. So as I mentioned before, there's no need to email your entire supplier list. You can apply the 80-20 rule. You can focus your energy on the top 20% of your suppliers who generate 80% of your emissions. There's no need to invent your own questionnaire for this, but you can do. There are multiple options for this sort of thing available. So for instance, we've got the sort of Caddy supply chain tool, CDP, EcoVadis, Evergreen, all those sorts of things. They've all got templates for that. If they've already reported, if the supplier's already reported elsewhere, why not make use of that data as well? They'll, in that format, they'll have already gone through the work, so you can make use of that without asking them to put it in a different format for you. And finally, instead of sending a blank sheet just demanding data, you can try an approach where you calculate their footprint for them first. So if you use the spend-based method we discussed earlier with their company SIC code, you could say something like, based on our spend, we estimate your impact is 500 tons. This is probably going to be wrong, and can you help us refine this and get some better data? So this sort of changes the dynamic completely between you and your suppliers, as it turns, instead of demanding data from them, it turns into more of a collaborative thing where they get to correct their emissions. So yeah, it brings me sort of to the end. Just to wrap up, sustainable procurement isn't just about having a perfect data set on day one. It's an iterative process. But I think the key is to just start now. You can use data you've already got, your spend data, to create a baseline, even if it's not perfect. As we've discussed, it's the sort of estimate, but an estimate's better than nothing. From that, you can then identify the hotspots, so you don't need to try and boil the ocean there. You can find the materials and suppliers that contribute the most to your emissions and focus your efforts there. You need to be clear on the data and know the difference between a corporate footprint and product footprint, and make sure to ask suppliers for the right one. And finally, you can collaborate with the suppliers, so move from estimating to managing by working with your key suppliers. And if you can do that, you're not just reporting numbers to a board, you're actively building a business that is resilient against future climate risk, and putting capabilities in place to reduce supply chain emissions going forwards. So yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yes, just coming back on that point, and please do put your questions in the chat. I think we will take these into the Q&A panel in just one second. Yeah, your point about identifying those hotspots there, if you could just go back over that, because a lot of us, I mean, when you look at Adam's doing, when you've got hundreds, thousands of suppliers, knowing that you don't need to look at all of those, are you using the spend-based approach and a little bit of pragmatism to work out where those top few are? Just if you could just roll that through again, that would be really useful.
Exactly. So that sort of approach does involve a sort of general level of sort of common sense, as it were. So you calculate your emissions based on the spend. A simple way to do that, if you're based in the UK, is you can use Companies House. Every company has their own SIC code assigned, and that's the same SIC code that you need to use for whatever you're buying from them. So that's a good way to categorize it. And then once you've got your full list of emissions from every supplier, just divide that up by the sort of manageable percentage that you think you can take on straight away. So you look at the top of that list, say example earlier we had of the steel supplier. You go direct to them, ask for their emissions data, or their product data if they've got that, and then sort of work your way down the list, and you can expand that year on year.
Yeah. Do you generally find that it really does boil down to a top sort of few that are the main contributors, just to get a sense from your experience of how that usually pans out?
Yeah, I mean, it very much depends on the company, but more often than not, it is that 80-20 rule that we discussed, because obviously most businesses will have that long tail of very small suppliers where you're ordering the odd thing from here and there, sort of your office supplies and
yeah, and like you say, you don't want to
thing.
boil the ocean.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And we will crack on with the Q&A session. So it's a little bit quiet in the chat. I know it's hard to be the first one to ask the question. I I do have a couple that have been submitted anonymously on email to me, so I'm going to fire away with those. Please do chip in, please, with your questions on the chat. Okay. The first one here is: my biggest supplier doesn't want to share their carbon footprint with me. What do I do? Panel, who wants to start with this one? I might go to Adam and probably rephrase the question of, have you run into any difficulties of getting suppliers? And I'm going to assume, following Stephen's example there, it's going to be the big ones that don't want to play ball. And what do you do in that circumstance?
It's interesting, right? So I suppose flippantly, you find a new supplier, but it's never that easy, is it? But I think we have challenges. We have an embedded supply chain. We have a lot of suppliers doing a lot of work across the system. We're having to take them on the journey of that it's not just us asking for data. This is a legislative requirement. This is an expanding requirement of the NHS as a whole. So I would say the positive side of that is that we're seeing more and more suppliers taking a proactive stance on their reporting. But for the ones for any areas that aren't, we're having to push back in terms of appointment. It's just becoming more difficult to appoint suppliers who aren't on that journey, which is absolutely right. And I think it's a conversation, going back to one of the slides I picked out, but it's a conversation with both those suppliers and the members of staff or the teams that are appointing those suppliers. So it might be within construction of hospital buildings, or it might be in supply of just equipment for medical care. We're having to talk to a lot of our internal staff to make sure that we're clear on what we need to now expect from our supply chain. So we can't just make decisions on PPE that's manufactured halfway across the world, used once and then thrown away. That's kind of no longer acceptable. So that conversation moves forward. And I think, and another point on that, and probably just relating into some of the points that Stephen raised. So we're looking at both ends of that supply chain, so not just the cost of the goods that we buy, but also the cost of disposing of those goods at the end of their life, because waste costs, they vary hugely depending on how we dispose of equipment within the NHS. So actually the business case sometimes hangs off that disposal decision at the end, and all of these decisions, particularly if we can demonstrate that through the life of a product there's a financial benefit for trust, then we're absolutely getting the support we need to make those shifts, and that's putting more pressure on that supply chain and our list of suppliers. So I think it's happening, but not uniformly everywhere, but getting there.
Great. I'll probably slightly rephrase that for Olivia, with your legislation hat on there. I guess this kind of behaviour of not wishing to share that kind of information or having that information would be surprising, given where we are with the legislation. You've told us about SCCR and SRS. I guess going forward, would that be a little bit surprising that suppliers wouldn't be coming forward and letting you know what their emissions are?
Yeah, it would be surprising. It's becoming sort of like a statutory requirement, and all of the the SRS, this new procurement regime, and obviously at the end of the day we've all got this one goal to achieve net zero. So everyone's kind of, not to sound cliche, but we're kind of all in it together to do this. So it would be strange for suppliers not to comply. So given the legislative changes, you'd expect people to be forthcoming with the information.
Great. Okay. I guess the other aspect of this is to make it easy for them, and for the smallest of SMEs, if they're faced with a situation of needing to measure their footprint, there are some very easy, and I think there are free ways as well of doing it. Stephen, do you want to comment on that? So the ease of measurement, so it's not this burden really for businesses.
I mean, in terms of small businesses doing that, there's definitely free calculators and things out there. Sort of Sustrax comes to mind. But essentially what those three tools will do will enable them to calculate at a minimum their scope 1 and 2 and sort of business travel. Ideally, we'd want their entire upstream scope 3, but as a starting point, if you're just using a spend analysis or something, that's good data to have, and any data is better than nothing. So it's just about pointing those suppliers to the easy to use tools. Say, look, it's as long as you've got your sort of energy data available, you'll be able to fill this out in no time at all, and give us some good data.
Yeah, very encouraging, very encouraging. We've got another question really here relating to what happens when you've got suppliers and some of them are reporting their scopes 1 and 2 and 3, and some of them are not. So that mix of data. I think I'm going to go to Olivia, please, to help us with that one.
Yeah, so when requesting this data from suppliers, at a minimum, you'll need their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that should be pretty simple because most companies are assessing their scope 1 and 2, those direct and indirect emissions. Best case, if you can get scope 1 and 2 and then upstream scope 3. So that is any emissions within the scope 3 categories 1 to 8. So that includes things like business travel, commuting, the purchase goods and services. You'll find that most suppliers would have done their scope 1 and 2, and then there are those that have done the extra. They've taken that extra step and looked at their scope 3, but essentially at a minimum, scope 1 and 2, anything beyond that, it just increases the accuracy of the allocation method to yourself as a company.
And are some of those categories, you mentioned categories 1 to 8, are they easier to do than the others when it comes to scope 3?
Yeah, so there are some scope 3 categories. So commuting, for example, to capture that data, the supplier would just need to circulate a commuting survey, home working survey. Okay. So these are very quick things that can be done. I feel like there's this stipulation that all of scope 3 is really difficult to measure. There are some easier emission sources in there that you can start with.
Great, thank you very much. Another one actually on email is, I'm going to pretty much read this out verbatim. We've measured our footprint, scopes 1 and 2, and that's all we've done at the moment. Where do we start on our supply chain journey? So it's kind of the where to start, a little bit overwhelmed maybe by it. I'm going to go to Adam on this one, please. Where to start, I think the question is.
I think, I don't know, it's sort of, I mean, I'm looking at this from a supply chain that's huge, right? So we've just got to start somewhere and start moving forward in those conversations. But I would say maybe start with the suppliers that are more engaged and more, more open to conversations, and start to get, the more, I suppose, reflect back to the last slide I put up, the more examples of good practice we can get flowing forward, and where we can demonstrate positive engagement, the more that moves sort of the whole chain forward. So we engage with some of the more troublesome areas. So I think certainly what I found, and again, I'm relatively new to NHS, but I found in the months I've been working, the more good examples we can use starts to then generate that sort of positive momentum within teams to just build things. And also there's a certain degree of comparing yourself to other organisations. So looking at good practice elsewhere. You know, if there are other areas of in our case, other trusts that are making savings and making good progress, getting good press coverage, all those sort of really positive things, then that encourages decision making within our organisations to go in the same direction, and it is quite a good sharing environment. You know, everyone's pretty open to sharing ideas and moving these things forward. So I just think, maybe start, such a cliche, isn't it, the low hanging fruit, but start with the areas where you can make some progress, and then that will help the more difficult, the more challenging areas to shift in good time. So don't get too hung up on that.
And probably across to Stephen, I think I know what you're going to say here. Where to start with your supply chain? I guess it's down to that screening exercise that you talked about. Yeah, if you can explain.
So absolutely. I mean, you mentioned that sort of only covered scope 1 and 2. I think a good next step would be to cover all of the more controllable scope 3 areas they've got, the business travel, sort of maybe waste, that side of things. But then following that, absolutely go for the spend-based approach. It's the key with that is that you've got all the data available already. You don't need to reach out to those suppliers for any activity data, any spend data, because you've got that in your financial books already. So just use the data you've got, do an analysis, get the hotspots there, and then make a plan moving forward to reach out to those high emitters or the key sectors.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Christopher that I'm going to read out, I think here. I might paraphrase Christopher. This is about upstream and downstream scope 3. A lot of posts come in, and we use DHL, actually, I think, and Royal Mail. Are they able to provide customer MI, management information, that would help us on this? So it might be a little bit of, do we have knowledge within the team, if not of Royal Mail and DHL, of logistics and couriers in general, and getting data or from those types of folks? I think anyone could take this one. Steve.
I can take this one. Yeah. I mean, quite a few companies that we've worked with, I know with their logistics companies, they often do provide individual customer reports. So I think Royal Mail, for example, they've got a little client-specific slideshow that they'll send over with your specific emissions and they'll break it down by distance and weight of packages and that sort of thing. So just, I think reaching out to them is the best way to go, and I'm pretty sure they should be able to provide it.
I'm just minded of seeing some labels on specific labels and boxes and things, actually carbon associated with specific suppliers. It's either that, or I've had a fantastic dream about carbon labels on everything, which is also possible. I don't know, Stephen, do you recognise that? I think there are some proactive companies that are actually popping, even if there aren't specifics for the package you receive, you're getting some information. I'm also thinking about some examples of, and it's not quite the same thing, but waste contract providers who provide notes on the carbon of each of those services and report on that in way. Stephen, do you recognise that situation from proactive labelling, and I guess this would be on reports from suppliers?
I mean, somewhat. I think it's still a bit rare currently, but I think that's the direction it will be moving in. I mean, hopefully, like you say, everything's going to have an exact label on in the future with sort of, if you get a parcel delivered, it will say that this is the emissions associated with this delivery. But I think, I'm not sure the data availability is quite there at the moment to do it parcel by parcel, but I think it's getting there.
I think it's not far off. When you think of when you get your Amazon parcels, which I'm sure you do at this time of year, there's so much individual data that's related to you on there, and it knows what the consignment is. It knows exactly what you've got. It isn't so far away, as you say, Stephen, for that to include the carbon weight, if you like, of the package that you're getting. So actually that was the final question that we had actually on email was, is this the dawn of the product carbon label? Is this what scope 3 and supply chains actually need? I think they're probably also referring into that EU legislation as well, but it kind of pulls on all the aspects of what we've talked about this morning. So is this the dawn of the product carbon label? Who wants to go first on that one?
I can start if you like. Just insofar as that is what the the net zero roadmap for NHS products is starting to point at. So not quite there, but there are now defined timescales when that should be a requirement or an expectation for suppliers. So it'd be great if all the legislation neatly lined up to those same dates and we got a well supported position. But I think it's definitely moving towards that point.
I think I'll go to Liv next. Is that something that, do you think it is the dawn of the product carbon label, and do you think that would be a good thing?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing it more and more. Even when I go to my local supermarket, like the things I'm picking up have sort of like this product is 100 grams of carbon. So it's helping customers make those more informed decisions. I think it's a really good idea, especially when they have like QR codes and things that then can direct you to their sustainability web pages or the emissions report. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing, and I'm seeing more and more of it.
Yeah. I think you're dead right on that. Where there is choice, we can make those decisions in a positive way. I think you've probably answered the question I was going to ask Stephen about how would you evidence that, given that if we've got a product carbon label, there's not much space on a product for that to go, and it's quite premium real estate or whatever it is, whether it's a package with some PPE in it or it's something in the supermarket. Obviously there isn't much space, and obviously within medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, obviously there are a lot of compliance things that go on there. So the finding room for the carbon label, what do you think the best way is to evidence that when you haven't got much space to fit it on, and you don't want to be just making a really blasé statement that the EU is not going to like. So how to keep that nice and compact?
Well, I guess the key is to keep any labels you're putting on things very simple. You want the key total carbon amount on there. You want some sort of reference to whether it's been verified or assessed or something. But as Liv mentioned, a QR code is a great way to save space. You could link it to things like Caddy, for instance. So anyway, you can disclose your data for free. A link to that page there will allow people, if they want to look further into those carbon details past just the number, where all the data's come from, that sort of thing. Absolutely link it to your website or a disclosure platform, that sort of thing.
I think it will make so many of our lives so much easier when those are actually in place. So bring it on. That's what I say to that. Right, just before you go, if you would like to see even more Sustainable Business Network content, it's all here on our video feed on demand. So please do go check out the playlist on that. And we'll be sharing that link obviously in the mailers. I know we often do. And the session today will be put up onto that by Monday. So that's going to be there. So please do check that out. I need to say a huge thank you to all our speakers, Olivia, Adam and Stephen, for your excellent presentations today. Also, I need to say thank you to the three councils shown here, Rushmore, Basingstoke and Dean and Hart, for supporting these sessions. It's very much appreciated. And a huge thank you to you for attending the session. So please do take a second to grab that QR code, tell us what you felt, tell us what you'd like to see next. All that remains is for me to say have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.